Hey everyone, the name's Vander, and I'm tracking down that son of a bitch half-elf that got my grandpa eaten. You can't hide forever, darling. Kisses. Oh, and you're listening to Campaign Spotlight.
Hey there, boffers and beanbags.
Welcome to another episode of Campaign Spotlight.
This week, we'll be chatting with Rex, who's written for LARP events and also helped run them.
Throughout the interview, Jake and Rex keep on saying LARP without really defining it. It stands for Live Action Roleplay.
Sorry about that.
Let's roll initiative.
Your cloak is doing very little to protect you from the crisp winter air as you stand huddled with the others awaiting the announcements. And above that, it's itchy. The fabric is still stiff and new, having been purchased much later than you anticipated, with little cause or ability to break it in beforehand. In fact, all your gear hung a little heavy, fit a little bit awkwardly, and shined a little bit brighter than the people gathering around you. It was a matter of experience, you tell yourself. In time, you'd be a veteran, chatting with old friends, while some shiny-eyed newbie wondered when their sword would look and feel as natural in their hands as it did in yours. Your line of thought is interrupted as the constant chatter around you dies down, the sudden silence pulling you back into the moment. A man draped in finery joins the crowd, flanked by a waifish young woman in priestly vestments and a large armored fellow in knightly regalia. All eyes are on them, veterans and newbies alike, as the speech has begun. The town rumors mean very little to you. Those names were just names at this point. Apparently dinner tonight would be cassoulet, a hearty, warm stew to help brace the cold night. The reports of the bandits in the woods, though, and the specters haunting the cabins, that was a little more alarming. But that's what you came here for, the thrill of adventure. Finally, reveling in the thick air of anticipation, the finely dressed man spoke the words you've been so eager to hear. Game on.
That was so intense. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is different than any of our other introductory monologues ever, all of which have been more tabletop focused. We'll get into that in a bit. First off, Rex, thank you so much for coming on Campaign Spotlight.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so this week we're going to be talking about LARPing.
Yeah, which is similar but legally distinct from tabletop gaming.
So yeah, I guess why don't you tell us a little bit, just a real broad summary of your experience, writing for LARP games.
I was asked to join staff for a offshoot of the Gothic Lineage LARP system in about 2019, like the start of the COVID lockdowns, and we spent like 3 years world building and theory crafting, really just everything that we wanted to make like this limited run game, because we were only going to run a set number of games because the head storyteller had a specific story that he wanted to tell. And so we spent 3 years in lockdown writing and crafting and getting everything good to go for when we launched in 2022.
Wow. And so this is a huge undertaking in terms of the amount of writing that happens before the actual sessions.
Yeah, thankfully a lot of the writing was done because this is like a branch of an existing property. So a lot of the lore and background stuff was already like written for us. But we still had to pare down some of the mechanics because this was a smaller scale game. You had to tell a story in this previously unexplored region in the system. So we had like a lot of stuff to like flesh out and create. You got to invent like holidays and family lineages and pantheons and all that good stuff.
Oh, fascinating. And before you were doing this, you had quite a lot of experience in tabletop gaming as well?
Mostly as a player.
Okay.
Running tabletop games, I run very specific systems. Mostly World of Darkness and Pokemon tabletop adventures. So I have some experience on both sides of the table, but mostly as a player.
Fascinating. And I guess World of Darkness has a similar flavor almost to Gothic?
I would say that they're sort of comparable, especially if you're playing like a human in the World of Darkness setting, where all of this like fantastical stuff is happening around you, but you're just a dude.
It is kind of fun, these systems where like some people really have powers and some people are just like, hi, I'm Steve from marketing, normal humans. But I guess I want to talk more about Gothic, but we should talk a little bit more about LARP more broadly. Your introductory monologue kind of queued up what it feels like to be at your first session.
Yeah.
What does the session look like? Can you describe that experience for people who've never done this?
So it definitely varies depending on the kind of LARP. There are like day LARPs, there are parlor LARPs. What I'm most familiar with is like weekend long events. So you go out to the campsite Friday night and you're there until like Sunday afternoon.
Wow. And so you're fully in character when you're eating, when you're getting ready for bed at all times.
So most games have like off hours after 2 a.m. Because that's mostly when staff is asleep. We're not like running plots. We're not throwing monsters out. We're resting up to run stuff the next day. But in my experience as a player, like even after like safe hours, like players are still like in their cabins or in their tavern in character doing stuff.
And people are fully dressed up and everything for the whole event.
Yeah, absolutely. You get into garb Friday after you check in. There are some players who have like multiple outfits for the event. Like I know a player who brings 3 dresses for every day. They have like a breakfast dress, a brunch dress, and then an evening gown. Some costuming is like a very like big part of LARP. There are some LARPs that have like costuming requirements that they're very strict about to make sure that you're like in period and not breaking immersion. There are some LARPs where like if you're not a member of this household or this faction, you can't wear this color. In my experience, Gothic is a lot less intense about that, but you still want to look your best.
Oh, absolutely. That seems like a big part of the fun.
It is part of the fun, yeah.
And if you're spending a whole weekend, you might as well have 3 dresses for every day, if you're told.
Go big or go home is the motto of a lot of LARPers. My first LARP weapon is a 6.5-foot claymore.
Wow! If you have any pictures of it, we'll add one to the show notes for this episode because that sounds incredibly
I have
cool.
so many.
Of course. We'll get some of those from you after we record. Let's talk a little bit about weapons, actually. What does that look like?
So it depends, again. There are, like, different kinds of LARPs. What I participated was a boffer LARP, where you have, like, physical representations of your weapons. And even then, there are a wide variety. Like, some people's weapons are just, like, PVC pipes wrapped in styrofoam that meet like the length specs of certain weapons. But then there are other players who like buy like replicas off of like sites that make LARP weapons, like Kalamazoo or Medieval Armory.
Wow. Okay. But these don't have, or maybe they do, sharp edges.
No, it's
or
foam.
Like the actual.
It's foam.
Okay. when you said replicas, I wasn't sure if this was like, oh, this is actually, a
There
real thing
is
where
that
someone
kind
is-
of LARPing. Like there is that kind of like come combatant like fighting LARPing. That's just not what I'm into.
That makes a lot of sense. And in addition to these, physical combat where you're actually, trying to hit people with weapons, in your experience, what is the social combat like?
So social combat is always very tricky because you don't want to make social skills too powerful because it doesn't feel great to have your actions dictated by someone else. Like
Right.
someone just put more stats in persuasion than you, so they can just come up and do a social call and have you do whatever they want. That doesn't feel good.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
there's definitely like a balance between making social systems usable and making them like fun to engage in.
This feels like a problem I think a lot of people experience with tabletop games as well.
Absolutely.
Where at some point you roll a really high number to persuade someone to do something.
But it's something
maybe
that they
NPC
just will not do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance. And I think a lot of lessons that you get from tabletop gaming translate very well into LARP.
That it really does sound like it, even though, and we'll get into this system in particular in a little bit, this is not a system that's really heavy on randomness and things like that, right?
No, there's no like rolling dice or like pulling cards like you would in like World of Darkness LARPs, where you have like your skill points and like your deck of cards to simulate rolls. This is with both social combat and like physical combat. You have skills, of course, because you're building a character, but these skills
Right.
come with like calls.
Right. Let's talk more about the system later, because I really do want to get into the weeds of how that works. But it does seem, how to say this, on one hand it is a little bit more immersive to not have physical cards when you're interacting with people in person. On the other hand, it does seem like quite a different experience from a lot of role-playing that we're used to, where there is that big element of randomness,
Yeah.
Riley and I tried some systems where there's no dice involved, and we find ourselves being like, I guess should we roll a d20 to figure out what happens next? Because it's legitimately, it's difficult if you're so used to having that random element
for sure.
to role play deterministically.
One of the things that I've come to really enjoy about LARPing is that separate from your character sheet and your stats and your skills on your character sheet, if it's something you can do in real life, you can do it in the game.
Wait, anything?
Yeah, there is a this isn't a LARP that I ran, but one of the LARPs in the area has like actual like locks on some of the like loot boxes, and if you can pick a lock in real life, you can just go pick that lock.
With period appropriate equipment,
Of
I'm
course,
assuming.
yeah.
You can't have bolt cutters and show up like that.
Yeah, you have to have like a lock picking kit with like the threader and the jigger. But that also comes into play when you're like writing plots and like figuring things out, knowing like what your players themselves are capable of.
That makes a lot of sense. And so you really do need to know who the players are going to be, at least somewhat beforehand?
Yeah. There's a character like building process, and lots of times like staff will like work with like the individual people to help them build their characters so that we can get a feel for the kind of stories they want written for them, the kind of experience they want, if they're more like a combat heavy character that wants to be thrown into lots of like adventures and like dungeons and trials, or if they're more like a social character that wants to like sit back and participate in the like politicking and political machinations.
And is the solution to having those very different types of characters, is it telling some people, hey, this isn't the LARP for you? Or is it just having a whole lot of different things going on at once?
A whole lot of different things going on at once. That's why like a lot of LARP staff, they're pretty large because it requires like a lot of writing and manpower to keep things running. Because it's not like you're sitting at a table and one DM can be all 50 different NPCs you need for a session.
What does it look like then? As staff, what are you doing kind of minute by minute within a session? Are you like a referee
So
kind of
sometimes,
out of the story?
Okay. So during like side adventures where characters are going off into mod space, we do have like a staff member there with them to kind of like guide them through the mod, be there if there are like any rules calls that need to be checked or anything.
Can you explain the word mod really quickly for the audience?
Like a mod would be like an adventure taking place like in an area that is not the like defined town that the camping site represents.
Okay, so someone's in a dungeon for a little bit.
Yeah, it's like a dungeon.
Got it. Okay. And while that's happening, because the player can't really get the cues from the physical space they're in about what's going on, I guess that almost does need someone who's like a GM in that moment.
Exactly, yeah. So sometimes staff is doing that. Sometimes we're playing NPCs to see plot lines in the town. Sometimes we're in logistics processing like downtime actions or like crafting actions. Sometimes we're up at like staff headquarters, like sending out like NPC monsters for the players to fight.
How do monsters work?
So every LARP has normally like a few dedicated people there every weekend that are just there to be NPCs. And we'll give them like a stat sheet and be like, hey, you're a ghoul, put them in some makeup, give them like some claws and be like, all right, you're a ghoul, here's what you can do. Go harass the town.
That sounds like fun for maybe the first 10 minutes and then kind of stressful after that.
I mean, being a monster is a lot of fun.
Have you done it?
Yeah. Because even when you're like LARPing, it's not uncommon to like volunteer for an NPC shift to help out the staff. So for like some period of time, your character is off doing something out in the world, but you, the player, are like helping staff out.
What kind of monsters have you played?
I have played trolls, zombies. One time I got to play a dwarf. I've been a bogghast. Oh, I've also been like a very, very mean satyr.
Oh my. Very cool. And then when I want to just ask a whole interview of questions about being a monster in a LARP because it sounds really fun. But when you're being an NPC, a non-monster NPC in one of these situations where you're, seeding these storylines, as you said, everyone else knows that you're the staff member here, and they kind of take cues from you. Is that the right way to think about it?
So when we in the Gothic game that I was running, Gothic Louison, each staff member had like a prominent member of the town that they played. Me in particular, I played the captain of the guard, and I had a very specific costume for when I was captain of the guard. So when I went into town in that costume, people knew that I was there to like deal with the town guard or to send someone to go hunt some monsters in the forest. So that kind of like informed the players of what I was there for.
Right. And so everything is in character, but on some level people know, hey, this is the character that I should be listening to to see where there's going to be things happening.
Yeah.
Got it. And can you talk a little bit, let's talk a little bit about the writing actually. Were you just writing for the scenarios for which you were going to be the staff member supervising or overseeing them?
Nope, not at all.
Okay.
So a lot of times I specialized in writing personal plot for characters.
Oh. Can you explain that a little bit?
So a big thing with the Gothic system is that every character has like a personal arc that we want to see them go through the course of the game. And we discuss this with the players when they're making their characters, and it's kind of like informed on like choices that they've made in character creation, their backstory, perks and flaws that they take, and stuff like that. So you look at the data that you have in front of you, and you kind of like think up this character arc, and you write like little bits and pieces of it for the character to have every game, so that everyone has something.
Right. Everyone has kind of at least some character hooks in each session.
Exactly.
And do you kind of have an arc or resolution in mind, or is the idea to kind of set them up to have some kind of character experience?
The goal is to set them up to have some kind of character experience. There have been times where like we've sat down and like had an arc in mind for a character, but the way things played out, like it fleshed out completely different. But at the end of the day, the player had fun and enjoyed the arc, and that's what's important.
That's the best possible outcome. I guess, can you give some examples of what those arcs might look like?
So one in particular that I think about very fondly is a character who was a member of like the nature cult.
Okay.
And they have, for them, innovation and invention is a sin. They think that everything should like be returned to the natural ways. So like they look at engineering the same way they looked at magic. They were upsetting the natural world. But this character was a member of the town guard, and he used pistols.
Oh.
So I wrote an arc for him that was essentially like having to reconcile his spiritual beliefs with his desire to protect the town. Like young kid, I wrote like a couple of like young kid NPCs that like looked up to him, that were engaging in the sin of innovation, and then they would tell like their head priestess, oh well, you know, he uses guns and he's like an elder, so like it's okay. And basically just like kind of leading him into this situation where his upbringing and spirituality was at odds with who he wanted to be.
Fascinating. And so the young kids who looked up to him and that revered elder they were talking to, that was all kind of off stage beforehand?
Yeah, well, I would field like the revered elder was like another staff member. So this is one of those circumstances where like I wrote the plot, but like I didn't have like any really like direct hand in running it.
Right.
So like the staff member who was playing the elder like went up to him and would like talk to him about this and be like, you know, these kids look up to you and they see you like using the guns and engaging in like commerce and fraternizing with magicians. What do you have to say for yourself? Yada yada yada.
Fascinating. And what was the resolution of this plotline?
So the resolution of the plotline was that it's still ongoing.
Oh wow.
I think that player is currently taking a break from that character. But that plot line is still kind of hanging, and the effects are still felt like in the game.
Sure.
There are still like inklings of like a new wave of like young radical kids who are engaging with things that their religion tells them not to, because this one player decided that that's like kind of what he wanted.
Very cool. And so this kind of personal story actually has overarching story ramifications for the world.
It definitely can. Not every story is going to be like that, but like it definitely can, depending on where the story goes.
Were you also writing stories in addition to these character arcs? Were you writing, I don't know how you describe it, I guess scenarios in which multiple people would be inclined to participate?
Yeah, I wrote a couple of like big town events.
Okay.
Like social circumstances, or just like kind of like errant plots for people to engage in, like sending a crying NPC into the tavern, with like a story to see like who engaged with them.
Interesting. And so even though you were setting this NPC's kind of story up in their event, people could just choose to ignore it.
Yes.
Okay. And I guess there are a lot of these events happening throughout the weekend, or especially at the beginning of the weekend, and then some of them you can't tend to each one.
Correct. There's definitely also like an established pattern of events.
Okay.
So like normally Friday night is where we have like the newbie mod. All the new players get to go like on a special adventure
Nice.
that gives them kind of like buy-in with the town, because it gives like hints about like what the overarching plot of that weekend is going to be. So they have like buy-in to like interact with some of the older players to tell them what they saw in their newbie mod. And the older players use that time to like throw parties and feasts for mechanical benefits, because that's really like the only downtime they're going to get.
Right. Other than if you wait until after 2 a.m.
Yeah, unless you're waiting until after 2 a.m. But really, who wants to have a feast at 2 a.m.?
Honestly, yeah.
And then Saturday mornings are like social events. That's normally when the church service is held. Because there's like an in-game religion that has like church on Saturdays. Saturday nights, there's normally like a big like town conflict. It's normally where we send like large waves of monsters, or like one really difficult one into town.
So is that just like one NPC, or is it like 5 NPCs in one suit, or how is that implemented?
If it is just like one big monster, it's just one. But
Okay.
they have like super jacked up stats.
Got it. Okay.
Those are the like, we're sending like our best combatant out to be a monster.
Right. That is extremely fun. And then Sunday is also part of the game.
Yeah. So Sunday morning, that is normally just very chill, kind of like wind down time. A lot of like the gatherer players use that time to make like a final sweep in the woods to make sure they've gathered all of the resources. It is also another good time for feasts. And like small town events. I've hosted like a few fighting tournaments on Sunday mornings.
Oh, interesting.
Kind of just like winding down until time for game off.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It can't go right up until 2 a.m. Sunday night as well.
Yeah. Game off normally happens like at 1 or 2 in the afternoon.
Got it. And once they say game off, people are pretty quickly out of character.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of times people are out of character before the game off call. LARPing is exhausting, but it's so much fun.
Yeah. It seems... Let's talk about that a little bit. It does seem like this is... You're going to be wiped out after a weekend of this. Right?
Oh, for sure. Especially because, like, a lot of these campsites are, like, Girl Scout camps or Boy Scout camps that we rent out for these events. So their beds are not made for adult humans to sleep in. And it's not incredibly comfortable. So in my experience, at least, any sleep that I do get, isn't great sleep.
Are you allowed to bring modern, sleeping bags, or is it only period?
Oh, you absolutely can. There are people who also camp out on site, so they set up their tents and their sleeping bags. I know someone who went all out and they got one of those big 3-room pavilion tents and set up an air mattress and a little tea area. It was really nice.
That's extremely nice, yeah. And so when you're writing these events and, sending monsters into town Saturday night or something like that, this has to fit into kind of an overarching larger story that's happening in this town, right?
Yes, there is a meta story going on.
How do you coordinate with that meta story?
A lot of staff meetings. Staff would meet once a week. or like once every other week, depending on how close we are to game. The closer we got to game, the more frequent meetings were, to kind of like check in with each other, see what everyone's written, see how we can like fit this in to our disaster of a Google Calendar, because we would we like Google Calendar events, so like staff knew what was running when. So yeah, there's a lot of talking and coordination between staff members and like head storyteller and head of staff.
And the head storyteller is the person who's really got the meta narrative all mapped out. Is that the right way to think about it? And in this case, is the meta narrative? Can you talk a little bit about what the meta narrative was for this particular LARP?
I can't get into too much detail because it's still running, and there's a lot of like secrets that like people don't know yet.
Hey, this is every time I do an interview and I'm like, what's the big story of this campaign? That's always the answer. Can you give like a hint or like talk about what's happened so far?
So essentially, this region of the Empire is built on the body of a god. And in ancient times, this god gathered power by eating people.
Oh no.
And God technically isn't actually dead.
The god that everything's built on top of. Oh shit.
So the players are exploring, I guess, the corpse of a slightly dead god.
Oh wow! And so there is quite a lot of magic happening as well.
Yeah, Gothic is it is like a mid fantasy setting.
Now we're actively looking into what like LARP events we can get involved in.
Awesome. LARPing is a lot of fun. Like I was saying, like there are different kinds of LARPs. If you don't want to commit to like a weekend, there are like day events.
Yeah, I think that's the most realistic.
Yeah, there are a couple of like day event LARPs, and then there are also like parlor LARPs, which are just like, you know, a couple of hours. Those are more role playing focused, and less like action combat, physical stuff. Which also is not a bad place to like break in.
That makes a lot of sense as a place to break in, and because I guess especially in a 2-hour situation, if you're getting right into combat, that's not LARPing. That's like fencing class, effectively.
Or amped guard.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Also, we couldn't really do a full weekend one because we record interviews every weekend.
Oh yeah, that. You sure could.
I guess we could go there on site and be like, hey, we're scribes from the future, tell us about your character. And then a staff member would attack us and be like, you got to get out of here.
Maybe. There are some LARPs that are into it. I know that Gothic at least hires like professional photographers for the whole weekend. So there's someone going around with like a Nikon camera, like taking pictures out of the bushes.
I guess, honestly, any attempt to make a camera non-immersion breaking is going to be more immersion breaking.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, speaking of sufficiently advanced technology, it does sound like there's a lot of magic in this kind of Gothic setting, right? And I'm curious as to how that's handled, because you can pretty realistically simulate a sword fight, and I think you can pretty realistically simulate a heated social encounter, but how do you simulate magic?
So it goes back to what I was saying, how combat in Gothic is like a call system. Magic is also done by calls. That's how you get those calls are different. I know that the like public perception of magic and LARPing is like throwing bean bags at people, yelling firebolt.
Yes.
But in Gothic, to cast Firebolt is a incantation, several very complicated hand signs, and then a combat call, which would be like Fire Strike.
Can you explain calls a little bit more? Because this seems like an important part of the game.
So you don't... Gothic doesn't have, like, a health system. Like, there are no, like, health points. It's just if you take, like, a reasonable amount of damage, like, you're down. But you have, like, calls to determine how much damage you're doing and how much you're blocking.
Got it. And this applies to both physical combat and to social combat and to magic.
Yes.
Okay. And because I see in the rules there's a lot of conditions like despair or trauma. And would those also be inflicted by calls?
Those are conditions that can be affected by calls. Despair is normally affected by, like, something happening. Like you failing at, like, a personal goal or one of your loved ones dying. Despair is a powerful thing that not many things can just give you.
You can't cast despair on someone.
There is probably some mage that can, and I know for sure that there are some, like, monsters, or, like, in Gothic they're called malefic, that can give despair, but it is not like a regular call that just players can toss out.
Got it. So some of the monsters can actually be, or some of the, hostile NPCs can actually be really damaging to, like, the character you're role-playing in the long term.
Absolutely. Because, like, trauma affects, like, your skill cap. You can, when you're traumatized, your skill cap for all your skills becomes equal to your courage rating. So if you're not a courage build, suddenly, like, your skill cap is, like, 0. So, like, you can go from, like, being a master swordsman to, like, not being able to fight.
Which I think narratively works nicely, because you can't really have people die Friday evening and then they're just kind of hanging around, right? There needs to be persistent
consequences.
Exactly, persistent consequences, and you can't be like, oh, you'll be bleeding horribly for the rest of the weekend, because that's not necessarily a consequence that you can inflict in a way that
is, like,
feels
enforceable, or, like...
Yeah. And so can you talk a little bit more about, what happens if you drop to 0 health in general?
So there's a new rule where if your character would die, you can instead come back with, like, a major maim.
Oh, okay.
It used to be, like, if you died, you died. Or a lot of people, if they died, like, Friday evening or, like, early on Saturday, they would just become NPCs for the rest of the game.
Would they be like an NPC, like a ghost version of their character?
No, they would just, like, help staff out, be monsters, be generic NPCs. There have been times where we have sent people out as ghost versions of their dead characters to cause problems on purpose. Nothing kind of feels the same as seeing the ghost of your dead fiance that you watched die earlier come back and tell you that it's all your fault,
I mean, I haven't experienced this personally, but yeah, that does sound pretty upsetting. Okay, that makes sense. And so, I guess over the course of a weekend, what is the rate at which people are having these either character deaths or these, like, long-term negative consequences for their characters?
So I will say that in the time that I was actively staffing for Gothic, we didn't have any character deaths.
Okay.
It is not something that's super common. It is just a consequence that can happen. And I think it also is a good part in the kind of game Gothic Louisant was, where it is very community-focused and less intense than other Gothic games. That there was very little, like, character death.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by community-focused?
So the overarching, like, vibes of Gothic Louisant was this small community that's been isolated from most of the world for generations by a mystical force. It's just a very like tight-knit community. Even though they're on like two separate sides of like the religion coin, half of them are of the religion of the Empire, and the other half are like the nature cultists who have very like opposing views. A lot of the story that we wanted to tell was having them like come together for the good of the community.
Got it. Okay. And so you as writers were setting them up for situations where the outcome was everyone works together and collaborates to solve problems.
Yes.
Although I guess that might change once they realize they're on top of a still alive god that eats people.
Sort of alive.
And does this setting in any way hook up with or relate to other Gothic settings out there or other Gothic campaigns happening out there?
So there's only like one Gothic the Lion Age setting happening right now, which is Gothic Runeheim, and they're really only connected insofar as that they happen on the same planet.
Got it.
They're happening in two very different regions of the world, and this is like medieval traveling, like horse buggies, and so there's very little like room for crossover between the regions.
Got it. So the setting is persistent over time, but it doesn't really interact with other ongoing campaigns in the same setting.
Unless like, there is like another Gothic game happening in like the same region. Like,
okay.
It would be reasonable that maybe there could be some like intermingling, but yeah, for the most part they are separate campaigns that are happening in the same setting.
Got it. Okay. And this system in particular really seems to focus a lot on these interpersonal interactions to start with. Like, compared to other, from what I can see from the rule set, compared to other LARPing systems, it really does seem focused on these interpersonal role plays and a lot less on the throwing beanbags at each other.
Yes.
And so I guess that helps for this kind of story that you're mentioning, where everyone's working together.
Yeah, and I think that is actually like a recurring theme in most of the Gothic games. Like, at the end of the day, it is about this community of people who have gathered together, coming together to overcome whatever weird shenanigans staff has decided to write for them to overcome.
Can you give an example of like what the big shenanigans for a weekend that they had to overcome looked like?
So, in every Gothic system, around Halloween,
Yes.
there is a big event called the Longest Night.
Okay.
Every year on the Longest Night, that's when like the Malefic are strongest, and it's normally like a rough night. They're constantly throwing monsters at us. There's a lot of just shenanigans happening. My first Longest Night, one of the staff members was going around causing despair in characters by whispering their darkest secrets in their ears.
Oh boy! Oh wow!
And the staff member that was doing this did such a good job that like several players, like myself included, like actually started like crying in real life.
Oh my goodness!
Because you're just so in character, like over the course of a LARP, like you embody your character in such a way
Right.
that like these like cutting remarks at them like actually hurt you.
It feels personal.
Yeah, it feels personal.
And what was the challenge there? Like, how? I guess how did that the storyline, which I guess started with activities like that, how did it resolve by the end of the weekend?
It was finding out who that spirit was, what their story was, and laying them to rest in a way that they could pass on to the afterlife.
Well, that's kind of beautiful, honestly. Okay, and this is interesting to hear what the stakes are like, right? Because I think with tabletop gaming, the stakes can get so grand over time, and by the end of a campaign, the stakes are like we're in heaven and we're doing battle with God and everything like that. But you can't really. I guess you could have that happen in LARP, but it wouldn't really feel
the same.
Yeah, and so it's helpful to hear what the stakes are like. It is these personal kind of smaller scale stories, eh?
For the most part, yeah, it is very like it is a lot more grounded than you can do in a tabletop game because it is more physicality and in some instances less imagination.
Right. Especially for social encounters, because although it does look like in this world there are kind of stylized social moves, right, that you can do. I guess would those be examples of calls as well?
Yeah. So if you're playing like a noble character and you have like enough ranks in the etiquette skill, you can call. I forget the exact call, but like it's authority. You can call authority, and anyone like of a lower social rank than you has to stop talking.
Wow. I need to make sure that in my campaign my players never learn about that one because they would abuse it. Okay, so in addition to these relatively formalized calls, people are also just having conversations in character, right?
Correct.
That don't use any mechanics, that are just kind of...
A lot of the players feel that instead of using like persuasion calls, it is much more fun to actually just try to persuade the person.
That makes a lot of sense. And I will say, from the rule set for Gothic, it seems like there is a lot of room to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, I think a challenge that people run into with tabletop games sometimes is there's a lot of rules that basically allow you to compel. And they're often targeted to NPCs, right? I think of things like command in D&D. And it's like, if you use that on another PC...
It feels bad.
It feels really bad.
It feels really bad.
And it wrecks the fun of the game just a little bit. And so it is nice that this system in particular does seem designed for just those free-form character interactions.
Yes, like have a conversation, see if you can convince me, and it is also like a game of like figuring out like what each character's like beliefs and values are, and learning how to use that in conversation to convince them to do stuff. Making them see like, hey, I know that you value this. Here's how what I want, like, will benefit that.
And are you as a writer setting up those interactions, or are they just kind of
sometimes
happening
absolutely
organically?
A lot of times, like, a lot of the best role playing I've seen happens between players. Like staff hands off. Just there have been so many like good moments where players are just like talking to each other that's like, wow, I could not have written that better.
And you have, the dead fiancés waiting outside to run in, and you're like, no, this is fine as it is.
There have been a couple of times where like we haven't run a plot that we were going to run because the players were making their own plot.
Wow, can you give an example of what that sounded like?
So at some point, like, the players decided to form a town council because the noble that was in charge of the town, like, stepped down and lost power pretty much. So the town was out without leadership. And in preparation for the empire sending in someone to rule the town, the elders of the town were just like, we'll put together a council of the heads of all the families to handle any issues that come up. And we were I forgot what we were going to run, but we decided to just like let them sit there and like figure out this council and how it was going to work and kind of let them run with that. So then we had something to run with.
Absolutely. And did you have to implement any of that mechanically? Like, did this change how people's ranks or authority worked, or was it purely just PvP or
just strictly just like a player-driven roleplay.
Wow. And was it persistent? Did the council continue?
The council continues.
That's wonderful. And I guess it takes... How much selection of players is there to ensure that the people who show up are the type who are going to take that sort of initiative?
I would say that the players that like show up to Gothic games and know what the like kind of what the system is and how it is are all kind of that kind of player. LARPs attract the kind of players that would thrive in their kind of like environment.
And so people really do self-select in. And so when they show up to the website and they see character-driven roleplay right at the top of the first page, that's going to appeal to the people who want to start the town council.
Yeah, absolutely. And
that makes a lot.
The same.
Oh, go for it.
The same is also to be said for like LARPs that focus more on like combat or like meta plot. Like a LARP will attract the kind of people that want to be there.
And in this case, there is a meta plot, but it sounds like it's quite slow moving and is not the focus of every specific weekend.
Correct. There are always like machinations of it going on. Like there are parts of like the dungeon to explore. There are things going on that are connected that the players don't realize are connected yet. But it really is just a focus on telling the stories.
Right. And telling the stories and also just kind of stepping out of the players' ways and letting them tell stories as well.
Which is honestly, like, as both a player and a staff, an awesome experience.
I mean, it sounds incredible. To what extent are people, when they interact with this, these overarching meta-narratives and these long-term plot lines, to what extent are they being reminded of it every weekend of the LARP, I guess? To what extent is it... is that persistent world, are people really just keeping it in their heads, or are you giving them signals and signposts at the beginning?
So a lot of players do just like keep it in their heads. I know that every LARP has like a Discord server, and people are like constantly in Discord, like sharing bits of information they've gotten, plotting what they want to do, like next game, making moves, making deals.
And then they can really hit the ground running when they get there Friday.
Yeah, exactly.
This sounds so incredibly fun. Like, Reilly and I are already scheming to find a way to get involved, at least in, some kind of maybe short-term one-evening LARP situation.
I would recommend, like, every tabletop role player to try LARPing at least once. I was honestly like pretty reluctant to try LARPing like a few years ago. My first LARP was in 2017 when I moved to Washington. And it had been something that like I'd thought about for years, but I was always like real reluctant to try for some reason. But it really is like everything that I love about tabletop role playing, just kind of like distilled and intensified and like given to you all at once.
That seems like a great note to end on. Do you have any other final thoughts about writing for this LARP?
So, I think the big thing about writing for LARP, making it different than writing for like a campaign, is the scope. Because for a tabletop campaign, you're writing for like maybe 5 or 6 people. For a LARP, you're writing for upwards of like 40.
Wow.
So if it is important to like lean on like your co-writers, the other staff members. Writing for LARP is not something that you can really do on your own.
Right. And everyone involved in writing has been part of that same LARP in the past, right?
For the most
These
part,
are
yeah.
people who know the characters, know the world, know the overall vibe of it.
Yeah.
And are willing to spend a lot of time in Zoom calls and on Discord getting everything together.
A lot of time on Discord. I've had hour-long conversations about the menu that we want to serve.
It has to be in-character immersive menu, I guess.
Yeah, you want to keep it like appropriate for the region, but also like cost-effective for us buying it.
Right.
And also within like the skill set of the people cooking.
You know, I think for a lot of parts of the world, there is a traditional form of gruel, right? And then there's no downside. It's easy to make, cost-effective, and that's what adventurers would have eaten, is boiled grains.
You're not wrong. Oatmeal is always a good choice.
I do love a good oatmeal. Do you have any, I guess, when you were writing, did you have any media or books or anything like that really served as an inspiration to you in terms of the sort of stories that you were crafting and the narrative threads you wanted to include?
I think a lot of my writing style is very heavily influenced from like books I really enjoyed as a kid. Particularly Pendragon, Percy Jackson, and Animorphs.
Oh, absolutely.
The stories that I really like telling are very much the inherent hope of humankind versus the dark, awful, terrible shit that happens to us every day. And I think that like those three series in particular like encapsulate that pretty well.
And they're also series where it is just a small number of people consistently working together over time end up solving pretty big problems.
Yeah, exactly.
That's I guess that gives your scenarios a really optimistic bent.
I am a sucker for a happy ending.
Well, I hope that when the god that eats people wakes up, everyone gets a happy ending as well.
I'll let you know.
We'll have you back on like 2 years from now, and you'll be like, "Oh, we had an angry mob situation." Immediately after Game Off, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have any tools that you use when you're writing that are helpful for keeping everything in order? And also, and I think this is quite relevant for a lot of tabletop games as well, keeping the episodic story, tied in well with the overall narrative.
So I use World Anvil. It is a great tool for creating like episodic entries in a story.
Got it.
And I use Zoho Workspace for storing like all of my like rough drafts and ideas. It's like Google Drive, but doesn't feed AI your information.
Imagine that. Well, it doesn't feed AI your information yet. Or has Zoho promised to be good about that?
Zoho has promised to be good about that.
That's actually really good to know. I think we might have to switch over what we're using for the podcast too.
Unfortunately. But I think that World Anvil is a good tool for keeping track of things. Because you can also like add in like... You're basically building a Wikipedia for your setting. And it's also like a good tool for like even players. They can look back at past events that they weren't like able to attend and like see what happened from like a just like strictly narrative point of view.
Which is helpful because sometimes, it's one thing to keep track of the lore, but it's another thing to keep track of what happened 3 days ago in story, 6 months ago in real life.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, I know my character would know this, but I have no clue
I
what
don't
was doing
remember
last
the
time.
name of this guy who came and told me this very important thing, and I need to talk to him.
Although, arguably, not going to lie, that happens to me all the time in real life, so maybe that's just part of the immersion, is being like, I should know his name, but don't.
Yeah, that is a route to take.
Remembering names and faces might be one of those skills where if you can do it in real life, you can do it in the LARP.
I have a personal habit of taking flaws in character that I have in real life.
Okay.
For instance, I always take the poor eyesight flaw because I don't LARP. I don't LARP with my glasses on.
Oh. But how does that work for anything physical? Or I guess is your prescription not that strong?
I'm very nearsighted, so
Okay.
in melee combat, I can see you just fine. But I'm not the guy that's going to be in the back line with the bow and arrow.
Or if you do have a bow and arrow, it is not going to go in the right place.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really interesting concept, actually.
Yeah.
I think I would need to incorporate that into characters in the future.
Just
the things
for
that I'm bad
XP.
at in real life. Yeah. I get lost easily, and I think that would work well as a character flaw. in a
Oh,
lot of
absolutely. I think there was
settings.
a flaw in Gothic for that.
Oh, perfect. Cool. Do you have anything else that you would like to plug, or would you like to recommend to people?
So if you do have any interest in the Gothic tabletop system, there are currently 2 running theaters, Gothic Louisant, which is ending its main storyline this year. So it might be a little if you want to catch the tail end of the story, it's ongoing. And there's also Gothic Runeheim, which is a grander scale LARP set in the cold, frigid north of Viking territory. And then separately, there is an offshoot LARP called Gothic Age of Ashes, which is an alternate timeline, post-apocalyptic kind of future story to check out.
Ooh. And those are all kind of very large scale weekend session type LARPs.
Yes.
Okay.
I believe if you're looking for a day LARP, there's one called Refuge, and there's just a Saturday afternoon in downtown Seattle.
Perfect. Wait, downtown is in you're running between the buildings?
No, it's a park downtown.
Okay. Yeah, we'll link to all of those in the show notes. We're actually pretty close to downtown Seattle, so I think for me and Riley, that would probably be the one to try out.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the other games that I partake in, we rent out a site in Onalaska.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
So you fly to Alaska
not the state of Alaska, the city Onalaska.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, this is more intense than I thought. Maybe for the Viking immersion, you go to
We do get
people.
we do get people who drive down to Gothic from Canada, which blows my mind every time. It's like, man, you are crossing international borders.
I mean, it's not that far, but yeah, it's got to be worth it for a weekend like that.
I would say so. It is definitely an experience that I look at fondly.
I'm so glad to hear it. Rex, thank you so much for telling us about the Gothic system, about your experience writing, and about LARPing in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Happy to talk about it.
That's all for this week.
Thanks so much to Rex for coming on Campaign Spotlight.
Check out the show notes for a link to the rules to the Gothic LARP and a picture of Rex's giant sword. I'm Dungeon Inspector Jake.
And I'm Production Master Reilly.
If you're enjoying the show, subscribe and leave a review.
It helps other people find the show while also ensuring that none of your livestock mysteriously vanish in the dead of night.
For more on the show, including links to all our social media, visit foldedfrequencies.com/campaign spotlight.